Today of all days. Don't say a word.
Okay. But why is it black?
Extra crispy, my favorite.
Have you figured out what day it is yet?
Of course, hon. Happy, anniversary?
No.
You know, back in my day.
Dad, not
Are you and mom going to get a divorce? Also, what's a divorce? Also, what's a boomer? And why do you keep calling grandpa one?
Oh, hey, hon. What a beautiful meal. And happy birthday.
Nope.
No. Got it.
I was watching the news today, and you know.
Grandpa Steve filling mashed potatoes again. Also, where do babies come from?
All right, so today we're starting a brand new series called Awkward Dinners. Is there anyone who has not been at an awkward dinner? Yeah, right, just about all of us. Awkward dinners are intense, you know, because when you're around a table, everyone's just sitting there looking at each other, and if there's something that's not totally smooth, you can always feel it, right? Sometimes things get awkward because someone says something. Then other times, someone really needs to say something to like ease the awkwardness, right? So I got a little story for you. I mean, you know I got a story. So my wife and I, like when we first started dating, there was this one time where she invited me over to eat and meet her parents for the first time. Well, I had met them kind of in passing, but this was like the first sit-down dinner with her parents. And I wanted to make a good impression, and so I'm trying to get myself all prepared and everything and do all the right things. And so it comes time to eat, and I sit down at the table, and her mom had made shrimp. And they were great. It smelled great. They were seasoned really nicely. But for me, like at that point in my life, my experience with shrimp was very limited. So I knew, you know, like the Stop and Shop ring, you know, with the little dip in the cocktail sauce, and you got the tail, and you kind of get rid of the little tail. I knew shrimp in linguine and clam sauce, right? You know, not real much work involved with that. But I didn't know that you can also prepare shrimp completely in the shell, like totally shelled, and you can season them and cook them and serve them, and it's kind of like a peel and eat situation, and that's, you know, it's kind of like a thing too. I just had never seen it. So we sit down to eat, and the shrimp come out, and all I'm thinking about is the conversation and making a good impression. I see these shrimp, and I do what I know how to do with shrimp, and so I take it, and I like pop the little tail off, and I have the rest of the body that's still completely shelled, and I just put it in my mouth and start chewing, like chewing a lot. And for a minute, I'm like, well, this is kind of a rough experience, but maybe this is what shrimp are like, you know, in Virginia, which is where my wife's family's from. And so I'm chewing, and I'm just focusing on what the conversation is about, where this conversation is going, and I'm just eating these shelled shrimp. And during the conversation, something wasn't quite right, and I don't remember what was going through my mind, but it just wasn't as smooth as I wanted it to be, until finally my mother-in-law, she wasn't my mother-in-law at the time, but finally she goes like, all right, so is it like a Long Island thing to just eat the whole shell of the shrimp? And then I realized, you know, you're not supposed to eat that part. And the rest of the dinner was great, and it was smooth, and it worked out. We ended up getting married. But now I know. You can peel shelled shrimp. But it was awkward. It was definitely awkward until she said something, right? We've all sat through awkward dinners. What's really interesting is that there are a lot of awkward dinners in the Bible. Like in the stories about Jesus, there are a lot of awkward dinners, and he sits through a lot of awkward dinners. And sometimes these dinners are awkward because of him, because of something he says, or because of something someone's not saying, or because of something that someone is doing, but they're uncomfortable. And there's this one writer specifically who seems to love these awkward dinners. If you know the New Testament, you know that there are 4 versions of the Jesus story. We call them the Gospels. They're written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And they're all written by different people for different reasons to different people. And this one guy, Luke, loves these awkward dinners. And it's because there's a powerful point that's made during each one of these dinners. Now, here's what you need to know about Luke, right? Luke wrote the gospel, the Jesus story about Luke. Like, he recorded all that stuff. And what you need to know about him is he's someone who most of his life, he would be considered like what we would call a not for me, you know? Like, there are some people probably in your life that when you talk about church and like religion and God and all that stuff, they're like, no, it's not for me. Maybe they're not hostile to it, but they're just like, no, not for me. We actually did a whole series a few months ago called Not For Me. We're talking about why your friends don't like church, right? Maybe you are a not for me. And it's for whatever reason. You're just like, oh, God, Jesus, I don't know, not for me. Maybe Christmas and Easter, but the rest of the time, no, not for me, right? So Luke is one of these guys for most of his life. He's what they called back then a Gentile. He wasn't part of the religious community, but he writes, eventually buys into this whole Jesus thing, and then he decides he's gonna write an entire version of it specifically for a whole group of not-for-me's. Like an entire group of what they call the Gentiles. And he's like, you have to see the way that Jesus interacts with these people that don't fit the religious mold, that don't check all the boxes, that you wouldn't expect Jesus to be cool with. And so if you're here today, maybe this is your first time, maybe you've been here a few times, you're not totally sure what to think, this is a great series for you because it's a cool opportunity to see the way that Jesus interacts with people that are not like normally within the religious community. And it almost always, well, not almost always, but often happens around a table at some kind of meal. And so the first awkward dinner actually happens at this party. It's a big banquet, and there's actually a scene that kind of leads up to it, but it makes a pretty powerful point. And the story has the ability to really comfort a lot of people, but it also challenges a lot of people as well. And so I'll show you the story. Here it is. This is the first dinner story in what we call the Gospel of Luke. It says after this, Jesus went out. Now, if someone's telling you a story and they say after this, your question is, well, after what, right? So we want to understand this in its context. What just happened, the thing before the after, is there were all these people who wanted to be around Jesus. Like, he is crazy famous, like celebrity, paparazzi famous at this point in his life, and everyone wants to get a piece of him. There's even this group of people that tears the roof off of a building just to get inside of where Jesus is. And so people are coming to Jesus. Well, at this point in the story, Jesus goes out to people. Now the tables have turned and he's out walking around. And so who does he go and see? Well, it says after this, Jesus went out and he saw a tax collector by the name of Levi sitting at his tax booth. He was a tax collector doing what tax collectors do. Now, if you're familiar with the Jesus story, you've probably heard tax collectors were not like everybody's favorite person. And it's not just because people don't like to pay taxes. It was because of how someone became a tax collector. Like back then, this is a little bit of historical information, but it's kind of important. Back then, the ancient Jewish people, like Jesus's people, the people that he showed up, arrived to, and spoke to first, they believed that God had promised them this land and this way of life where they could flourish under his rule, like really practice their religion. And they dreamed about this, they prayed about this, they believed God had promised it to them. But at this point in the story, the Roman Empire, which is this crazy, powerful military force, basically conquers the entire world. And so while there's still this Jewish community, they're under the reign of the Roman Empire. And all these people in this community, they see the Roman Empire as these people that are getting in the way of what God had promised them. So they're the enemy. And not only that, they're not nice. They make things really, really difficult. They put limitations on how they could live, on how they could practice, on how they could worship. And so the ancient Jewish people hated the Romans. They were also forced to pay taxes to Rome. So to support financially the Roman Empire. They hated this on so many levels. Well, the Romans needed people to collect the taxes, but they didn't ask the Romans to do it. What they would do is basically offer the position to Jewish people in the community. And it was a really well-paying job. And so if you were a tax collector, you were seen as a traitor, someone that had turned on their own people to go get rich by oppressing their own people. And so this guy, Levi, that we're talking about, was really wealthy, and he got really wealthy because he was taking money from his own people. His family would have totally cut him off. They would have considered him dead. In fact, in this community, they had special rules just for tax collectors. Like areas tax collectors, like you weren't allowed to associate with them. They were considered just detestable. Not only that, this guy Levi, if you know the story, he makes really great jeans. Just kidding. He's also named Matthew. Matthew. He shows up in other places and he's referred to as Matthew. The reason Luke tells us his name is Levi, names are a little bit different back then, is probably to let us know that he was from he was a Levite, which was a certain kind of Jewish person. And the Levites were religious leaders in that community. They would serve in the spot of like a priest. And so what Luke is trying to help us see here is Matthew is just like, he could have been this, but he has chosen to turn on the people that love him to go serve people that are oppressing the people he loves so that he could profit. It's just like they could not stand tax collectors. And Jesus goes and he sees him. So if you're rolling with Jesus and you're part of his crew, you're like, finally, Jesus, our guy is like, gets to see one of these guys, and you're expecting him to crush this guy like a bug, like call down lightning from heaven, call out bears out of the woods to destroy this guy. That's not what Jesus says. He sees Matthew, Levi, at his booth, and he says, follow me, come. This would have shocked everybody. He's inviting him to join him. Now, this literally means like follow, like I'm the leader, you're behind me, we're going this way, right? But it also was common terminology that rabbis used to their potential disciples, or like teachers used for their potential students. So if you were part of that culture and you were a rabbi, which means teacher, you could put people through this like training, and if they made the cut and they were gonna be one of your followers, your disciples, you would address them with this phrase and be like, follow me. It's like saying, you made it, you're in. And so Jesus addresses this guy sitting at a tax booth, a rebel in his rebellion, at his spot, and he's like, you're good with me. And people are shocked. Like no one's cheering in the background. Jesus' followers, they would have been like oppressed by this guy, Matthew. They probably knew who he was, Levi. But he shows him radical acceptance. And Levi responds right away. Like he's shocked, I'm sure, but Levi gets up. You have this famous guy that thousands of people are following. You're the outcast. Your family doesn't even love you anymore. And this guy goes to you and he's like, you're with me. And so he gets up and he leaves everything, leaves his situation. He didn't like give up everything he owns because we know he still has a house from the next verse. But he goes and he follows him. It's in essence what Jesus is saying here is ready? He's saying, you're good with me. He may hate you. They may hate you. You may have hurt them. And maybe it's understandable that they don't like you. But you're good with me. Like step one in the Jesus process is what we could call here like radical acceptance. It's unexpected. Nobody sees it coming. It's confusing. It's undeserved. But his first message to this rebel in his rebellion, and Levi's not sitting there like crying like, oh my gosh, I can't believe I'm a tax collector. He didn't just write an apology letter. He's not apologizing. He's not remorseful. Luke tells us he's a tax collector at a tax booth, being a tax collector. And Jesus is like showing him this radical level of acceptance, which is confusing to everyone involved. We have a fancy church word for it. We call this grace. It's undeserved favor. It's you did nothing, but I'm in your corner. And this is the posture that Jesus has toward everyone. And remember, this is Luke writing, right? He's writing as a former not for me, two not for me's. And he's like, look at how Jesus responds to someone who has wanted nothing to do with the religious community. His first step is not, okay, Matthew, you're gonna have to take this course over here. And if you pass the new believers thing, well, then you can come and be part of our group. He's not saying change. He's not saying his first message, the loudest, the clearest, the foundational message is you're good with me. Radical acceptance. He leads with grace. And it throws everyone off, right? But it's not over yet. Then it continues. That's just the pre-story to the dinner. It says, then Levi held a great banquet for Jesus at his house. Luke's very specific. You know why? He wants us to know it's at Levi's house. Do you know where Levi got the money to pay for his house and how he's paying for the food that he's feeding Jesus? He got that money from being a tax collector. And Jesus shows up at that house and participates in that party. And a large crowd, it's not just the two of them, a large crowd of tax collectors and others, remember that word, others were eating with them. Now, why eating with them? Why do we need to know that they're eating there? It's a party. We usually eat at a party, right? Why doesn't it say they were dancing or playing board games or like why that one detail? And the reason Luke tells us that is because eating in the ancient world had crazy implications. Like you didn't just get together casually with someone and eat. If you ate with someone, it communicated radical levels of acceptance. Like Jesus inviting Levi to come and join him, that was like here, right? But eating with him and other people like him was like crazy up here. Like next level acceptance. In fact, the religious teachers at that time, some of them wouldn't even eat with normal practicing religious people because they didn't see themselves on that same level. And they didn't want to accidentally communicate that they accepted the people that weren't doing things as well as they were doing it. And so to eat with someone was a really big deal. It's why if you know the rest of the story, how the church unfolds, the church for years, like centuries, struggles with who they should and shouldn't eat with because eating with someone meant so much in the ancient world. And so for Jesus to show up and be like, I'm eating with these people was just radical. It was a radical form of acceptance. It was a display of friendship to say, you're good with me. Like, make no mistake, I'm in your corner. It's grace. It's grace, and it's confusing. If there was ever a time in the life of Jesus, ever a time, where he would have been justified to avoid the situation, it's here. Like, he could have pulled Levi aside and said, hey, I heard you're throwing a party for me. I really appreciate that. Sounds like it's going to be a blast. But you know what? I don't really support where your money came from. And I don't want people to get the wrong idea. And it may look like I'm accidentally supporting what the Roman Empire has been doing to all these people. He had every reason to just be like, okay, so I'm going to sit this one out. Maybe you and I could go get coffee and no one will see. But Jesus prioritized accepting all people and communicating that. That was his priority. He prioritized that over rejecting certain behaviors. The main thing he wanted to make sure was communicated was that you're good with me. And sure, there's all these other peripheral things that maybe I don't support, maybe I'm not on board with, but I could be cool with you even if I'm not totally cool with what you're doing. And if you look all throughout church history, for the last literally 2,000 years, the church has gotten into serious trouble. We have gone like off mission. We have tarnished the reputation of the church when we have prioritized rejecting certain behaviors over accepting all people. And then what happens, what's communicated is that the church does not accept all people. And the loudest message is this is what we're against, not we're good with you. It's not radical acceptance. As a church, like as a whole, I think we need to be like more concerned, or I should say, we should be less concerned. If you're a follower of Jesus, you should be less concerned about appearing to be for something you should be against, and more concerned about appearing to be against someone you should be for. This is what happens when we prioritize rejecting, just so you know, we're against this, I don't support this, over leading with grace, like radical acceptance. And so understandably, these religious teachers, they're confused and they want to know, they've got questions, they show up. Here's what it says. It says, the Pharisees, this was the religious teachers, the religious authorities there, and the teachers of the law who belonged to their sect, their little group of religious people, they asked his disciples, Jesus' students, here's the question, why do you eat with and drink with tax collectors and sinners? Sinners. Now remember when Luke was writing this and he's telling us what's going down, he's like, Jesus ate with tax collectors and others, right? The religious people are like, why are you eating with tax collectors and sinners? There's an air of condescension coming from the religious crowd. Like, why do you eat with those people? Again, they don't want to know why do you dance with them, not why do you hang out with them, not why are you with them, but you eating with them is communicating something. It's communicating that you like are accepting them in spite of their behavior. And so they're confused. And Jesus replies, and what he says is surprising. Like, if you know this story, and you've got to fill it in with like layman's terms, like you might say that Jesus responds by saying, well, they need me too, right? But that's not what he says. It says, Jesus answered them, and he says, it is not the healthy, this word here means like sound, the well, who need a doctor or healer, but the sick. Now in the original language, the word there's not actually sick, it's a weird construction. It's those having badly, right? Like those having issues, problems. And then he says this, it gets more extreme. He says, I have not come to call the righteous, those who have it all together, but sinners, right? Now, don't miss this. He is using their words, right? The question was just, why are you with those tax collectors and sinners? He's like, I have come for those sinners, like those people. He says, I've come to call them to repentance. Now, repentance, that's a word that's just been totally ruined, right? By like the guys in New York City that hold up the Bibles with the cardboard sign that say repent. All right, there's like doom and gloom around those words. But in the original language, that word, it literally means to know after. Or could be translated to change your mind. He's saying, I have come for those people that you won't sit with, to teach them how to think differently, to believe differently, to change their mind, to change direction. But if you've got it all together, his simple message is, I have not come for you. If you put yourself in a group of the people that got it, I've got nothing to offer you. In other words, if we're gonna paraphrase Jesus' words here, okay? Here's what he's saying. He's saying, the problem is not that I'm eating with those people. The problem is that you don't see yourself as one of them. His point here, this whole story about Matthew, is that people are in need of radical acceptance in spite of their behavior. And that's step one in the process, the message, the method of Jesus. His message is that we're all in the same boat. We're all broken people with broken parts. And in spite of that, like we're told that at our worst, Jesus gave everything for us. And so yeah, sure, there are some of us that take our broken pieces and broken parts, and some of us like go to God for healing, and some of us are like, yeah, I'm not totally sure if I'm ready to do that yet, but either way, we're in the same boat. We are broken people with broken parts, and when religious people start to separate themselves from everyone else, feeling like, well, we've got it here and they don't, like there's a them, there's those groups that don't, them and they and those that are out to get us. Like you're missing the point. We're all broken people, all have broken parts, and we're all in the same boat here. And if you recognize that, well, then I'm here for you. But if you don't, I don't have anything to offer you. You know, if there's like a religious or a Christian hall of fame, right? The Apostle Paul has got to be like in there. He's written a huge chunk of the Bible. He started churches all over the world. He lived an unbelievable life. You know what he says about himself? He says, here's a trustworthy saying. It's worthy of full acceptance. He says, Jesus came into the world to save sinners. And he says, and I'm the worst of them. Like, that's what this is supposed to look like. Like an acknowledgement that we are broken people with broken parts. And as a church here, this is why we say, like in as many different ways as we can, you can belong before you believe. You have permission to be in progress. We use words like radical acceptance and grace, but it's this idea that you can come as you are. You don't need to pretend, because we're all of us are a work in progress, and there's a place for you here. You know what we're taught, if you like to study this stuff, we're taught that grace is what actually changes the heart. And grace is free. And sometimes in the church world, what's communicated is that like, yep, this is grace and it's free. And so you're accepted as you are at first. You don't deserve it, but eventually you're gonna have to start deserving it. Right? You get in for free, but you don't stay in for free. And you might start with grace, but slowly the grace gets pulled out of it, and it becomes like a performance-based religion where you have to keep working and doing all the right things just to maintain your status with God. But that's not free. That's That's delayed payment. That's you get in for free and you pay for it later. That's not grace. That's not what we believe. But we're told, the writer of Hebrews says that it's good for the heart to be strengthened by grace. Paul writes to Titus that it's God's grace that actually does the inward teaching within us. When we know, I might get this right, I might get this wrong, I might have my worst failure tomorrow, but that does not change where I stand with God. I'm still good with him. There's something about that that's light and free. And that's where real heart change comes in. And it's something, whether you're if you're not sure if Christianity is for you or not, if Jesus is for you, and you're like, I don't know if I want that, at least make sure that's the version of Christianity that you're keeping at an arm's length. The one that's about what Jesus has done for us, not how hard we can work for him. But if you've been in here for a while, if you've been in church for years, it's something you need to come back to over and over and over again. This is not something I have earned, and it is not something I can lose, because it was never based on my performance. And what that means for us as a church is that God changes the heart. It's our job to make room at the table, to make sure the doors are open, to make sure that you can come here and not feel like you have to pretend or play a certain part or act a certain way. Because we're all in the same boat. We've all got issues. And those are the kind of people, imperfect people, those are the kind of people that Jesus embraces. We're offered radical acceptance in spite of how well we're doing or how much we know. So if you're a church person, the question for you is, are there people in your life that maybe don't feel accepted by you because of how intentional you've been about rejecting their behavior? Maybe that's got to be flipped around a little bit. And if you're someone who's not a church person, what you need to know is that if you have received any message from the church other than there's a place for you here, that this is a place of radical acceptance, then that's on us. If that's not the message you've received, because that's how Jesus operated. And it's our job to make sure there's a place at the table. And sometimes, because of that, things are a little messy. Sometimes things are a little awkward. Sometimes things are kind of tricky to navigate. But it's worth entering into that discomfort because people are worth it. Just like Jesus entered into this discomfort and the confusion of sitting down and eating a meal with a bunch of people who had turned their back on the entire religious community. I'm going to ask the band to come back up here, but here's the story I want to leave you with. There is a guy who came to our church for the first time several years ago, and he came here because somebody that he loves had been coming here for a while, and she got into it, started getting involved with the team, and she's like, I'm in. And she wasn't a church person, he wasn't a church person, but she became part of the church. And he showed up, in his own words, he said, I needed to make sure she hadn't joined a cult. And so he started to come. And he was surprised to find that he didn't have to pretend, that there were other people like him here, that he felt like this could be a home for him, like there was a place for him here. There was permission to be in progress. He felt like he belonged, even though he wasn't quite sure what he believed. And he just kind of followed for a little while, just tagged along, until eventually, just recently at one of our recent baptism services at the beach, he pulled me aside and he was like, I believe that Jesus gave everything for me. I believe that he is who he said he was. And he's like, and I want to be baptized. I want to symbolize that fresh start. He says, but I just don't feel worthy because I've got issues. And I was like, well, that's it. Like, you get it. That's the whole thing. None of us deserve this. There's nobody who has worked hard enough to earn this fresh start. And where you start running into problems is when you start to feel like you do deserve it. I'm not saying you walk around beating yourself up, feeling guilty and inadequate. What I'm saying is that no one can earn God's complete acceptance, but it's given to us as a gift. And yes, you're given a fresh start that you don't earn, but it's not once. We're told that it's new every morning because you're gonna blow it again and again and again, but there are endless second chances. This is what it's all about. This is what Jesus meant when he said he came for people with issues, all of us. So there's a place for you here. And God is the one that changes the heart. It's our job to make sure there's room at the table.